The ripples of change in last year's midterm elections are spilling over into the run-up for 2020. That includes challengers in the Democratic primary to US Senator Ed Markey. One of them is the representative from the state's 4th Congressional District. We'd like to welcome Joe Kennedy III. Thank you very much for being with us.
Honored. Thanks so much.
I want to start with how you introduced this campaign, because you made your announcement in East Boston. Why did you do that?
Because I think the critical issue that our country is confronting today is the fact that far too many people feel like they are left out, locked out, overlooked, and left behind. You see that from a critique on the political left, from folks that are fighting and striving as hard as they can, yet struggle to make ends meet. You see that actually from an awful lot of Donald Trump supporters on the right, whose central claim is that the government doesn't in fact speak for them. So my decision to get into this race is to fight for not only those folks that feel left behind, but for a government that actually recognizes them. And I think a critically important part to that is you go where people are, you meet them where they are, and you let people know that you're going to fight for them every single day. And so yes, we started in East Boston. We went off to Via Victoria in the South End. We went up to homeless shelters and food pantries and opioid clinics. And we kept that pace going all throughout the course of the weekend, and we still haven't stopped. And it's a central part of what I believe in, what the central promise I think is for this government, and what people across the country, regardless of party, are yearning for at this moment.
Well, pundits will look at that as a campaign stop, but go back about 11 years earlier. You're studying law school, and what do you decide to delve into? But people with foreclosure problems.
Yeah, and look, I'd come out of the Peace Corps. I had this extraordinary experience living and serving in the Dominican Republic for about 2.5 years. I saw how the law could have an extraordinary impact on trying to make the lives for people better. And a short little walk from the community where I worked and the project that I worked on away, the law was completely powerless to address some of the systemic inequities that a Haitian community was experiencing in parts of the Dominican Republic. And so I went to law school to try to understand how you can use the law and its limitations to actually rectify some of that social justice and injustice. It got me into the court system. It got me into this extraordinary program at legal aid program when I was in law school, and it took me to the streets of Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, trying to keep people in their homes in the midst of a foreclosure crisis. And you see how the system works, how it doesn't, and sometimes protections with the best of intentions lead to people losing their homes, and the power of the law to actually keep people in it if people are aware of their rights and they have access to a lawyer.
I want to ask you about what you bring to the plate here, because people look at the incumbent. You know, he has a long record. He's pretty solidly progressive, shows up a lot with concerns for people. What do you bring to the table that he doesn't?
Look, Senator Markey is a good man, and I haven't said different, and I respect the contribution that he has made. I do think that at this moment that we are, given the urgency that we are confronting from the policies that Donald Trump implements in the White House every day, but also critically, the fractures and fissures that enabled him to win an election in the first place. This moment demands more than just voting the right way or filing the right bill. It demands a senator that is going to show up in every corner of our Commonwealth and make sure that people feel like their voices are heard and represented in Washington. It means that you're going to fight for the structural change to be able to implement those policies, for reforms like ending the Electoral College and the filibuster, so that you don't let a Supreme Court, 5 conservative justices, 4 of whom were appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote, Republican presidents that lost the popular vote, a filibuster which has been most prolifically used to stifle the civil rights agenda and the civil rights changes that we needed in the 1960s. You have to end those so that we can, in fact, make good on the promises we're making to our people. And third, it's about ensuring that you get the people in our offices that are reflective of the desires of the will of the people. And so it's going around the country campaigning for them, supporting them, and making sure that in tough elections, you're going to be there and you got their back too. I think on those issues, I can do a better job.
Now, one criticism you've already encountered here is that by challenging Markey, there's going to be an enormous amount of money and resources poured into the campaign in this state, when some of that should be going, at least more of it should be going to Democrats in other states trying to change the balance of power in the Senate. What do you think about that?
So I hear that argument respectfully. I just don't think it's true. You had a Senate candidate raise over $10 million in a quarter just a couple of weeks ago. I think objectively looking at the allocation of resources and the ways in which money is coming into these races, this is not drawing away resources from any other race, one. And two, I think that argument, the overall argument essentially is that by jumping into a campaign that somehow is going to energize a community, that's going to bring more people into it, that's going to get people excited about an electoral prospect, force and provide our Commonwealth with a choice about the future, that somehow that's a bad thing. That's exactly what a democracy is about. That's exactly what we should be doing. That a Senate seat, my uncle was honored and fortunate enough to hold a Senate seat for an awfully long time. As he said at every election, you have the opportunity to state what you're going to fight for, not run against anybody else. It's about your vision as to how you are going to use the honor of that seat and use that seat to leverage it for the people of Massachusetts. I don't see how having other people make that case is anything but strengthening for our Commonwealth and our country.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Congressman Joe Kennedy III, candidate for US Senator. Congressman, I want to ask you about healthcare, Ed, because you were once a student of Elizabeth Warren. She struggled a bit lately about explaining how that was going to be paid for with universal coverage. What would you say? How is this paid for, and what does the middle class have to chip in?
Look, I think a couple things. One, first off, the argument that this is somehow going to be a $30 trillion tax increase or expenditure that's going to come on the backs of American families is in and of itself a sleight of hand. For those of us that are fortunate enough to have health insurance already, most of us already pay a sizable bill every month through our premiums and additionally through our deductibles. What Medicare for All means, those are wiped out. So the couple $100s a month that I pay every month to an insurance company, that goes away. So what you're actually looking at is not some massive, not a number nearly as big as some critics would point out, but you take that expenditure that you put forth, that families put forth every month, and additionally, when you actually go to a hospital or go to a doctor through a deductible, you wipe that out, you credit that over to the overall bill, and then yes, you have to have a conversation about how we meet that additional need. There's myriad ways that you can go about ensuring that middle class families, working class families, aren't going to be taxed in such a way that makes access to healthcare prohibitive. That's the entire point behind the bill. The entire idea behind this is codified in a simple premise that in this country, the richest and most powerful in the world, you should be able to get access to the healthcare that you need when you need it. If other countries in the world can do that, I have faith that the American government and the American people can do that too.
I want to ask you about violence, because you were just at a conference put together by Mothers for Justice and Equality, people surviving violence, people who have to live with it in their neighborhood every day. What could you do about that the other candidates couldn't?
Look, I think being with a group like Mothers for Justice and Equality is always extremely humbling. It's a powerful moment to be in the presence of activists that have taken extraordinary loss and try to turn that into an opportunity to do good for people that they don't know, don't meet, and might otherwise experience the same excruciating burden. What I can do is, one, highlight those efforts. Two, fight day and night for legislation to try to actually make good on the promise of reducing violence, getting guns out of the hands of criminals, closing loopholes like the gun show loophole, the private sale loophole, but also addressing aspects after the fact, trauma, the mental health impacts of people that are experience violence on a daily basis. Too often, the reaction that our society has to gun violence is these mass shootings, the horrific school shootings that take place. It's not the daily occurrence of gun violence in our communities. It's not what you see on the streets of Chicago or New York or Boston. And we as a society have to reconcile with that as well and focus on the long-term impacts of what it means when children are exposed to violence on a daily basis and what we can do to actually stop that and help mitigate the trauma that they experience.
You were also at the epicenter of the opioid crisis in Boston recently, Mass Avenue and Cass Boulevard. What should the federal government be doing about that it's not doing so far?
Oh my gosh, an awful lot more. So one, getting back to parts that we were just talking about, this country needs a structural overhaul to our mental and behavioral health care system, and that includes substance use disorder. We have to ensure that everybody gets access to the mental and behavioral health that we need. And quite frankly, we don't. This is a system. I was a prosecutor. I remember a recent conversation with a sheriff from outside of Boston who estimated that roughly 90% of the inmates in the jail that night were folks that were suffering either from mental or behavioral illness or substance use disorder. Our system has criminalized people that are sick. You need to actually flush that system out, make sure that people get access to the care that they need, the practitioners they need when they need it. 55% of the counties in our country, 55% do not have a single practicing psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker. This is a massive epidemic that we need to invest in right away to ensure that people start to get the access to the treatment that they need. If you are able to shrink that gap upstream, you're certainly going to be able to target folks to reduce the population of folks that are in dire need of services downstream. For folks that are in need of services downstream, look, when you have folks that are suffering in the throes of opioid addiction or addicted to fentanyl, it is an extremely dangerous condition. It is one where relapse is expected. It is a brutal, brutal disease. You have to meet people where they are. You have to wrap services around them. You have to recognize that the vast majority of those patients are going to suffer some relapse, and you cannot let them go.
Thank you very much for being with us.
My honor. Thank you.
Candidate for US Senator Joe Kennedy III, Congressman from the 4th District in Massachusetts. We'll have more news in just a moment.